Hey everyone, I'm here on the shores of beautiful Lake Erie in the city of Cleveland. Cleveland is in the state of Ohio, but believe it or not, this used to be part of Connecticut. Before American independence, the English king granted Connecticut a sea to sea grant, which basically meant all land on one line from the Atlantic to the Pacific belonging to Connecticut. That means that parts of current day Nebraska, Utah, even California could have been Connecticut. But those dreams were dashed pretty quickly. The state of Pennsylvania got into a conflict with Connecticut and lopped off some of their land. At this point, Connecticut was completely disconnected from their lands here in Ohio, which they wanted to call Western Connecticut, but instead started calling the Western Reserve, which is why in Cleveland you can see a lot of places named after the Western Reserve. Pennsylvania had already taken a huge chunk of their land, and hell no was Connecticut going to let any more go. So they funded an expedition led by Moses Cleveland to come out here and start divvying up land for settlers to buy. Of course, when Cleveland came out here, the local natives got suspicious. It's always silly how the English king can just grant land from sea to sea. Apparently a deal was struck with the local natives and Cleveland bought the land. I always wonder how the natives saw these deals and these contracts and sales of land. Did they know that they were losing their land forever? Maybe they did and figured that conquest was inevitable and might as well get something out of it. In any case, white settlers thought that they had bought the land fair and square and started moving in. After America's War of Independence, Congress organized this land into what's called the Northwest Territory, and Connecticut lost its claim forever. Cool, because San Francisco, Connecticut doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue. Later, when the British invaded America in the War of 1812, they were quite the arsonists. You may have heard that they managed to burn down the White House. Well, they also burned down a lot of villages. And so land was set aside after the war for people who had lost everything in the war. Specifically this area, which they called the Firelands. Getting your house burned down sucks, but to move to a place called Fireland sounds pretty badass. Later, before the Civil War, this whole area was a hotbed of anti-slavery activity. A lot of the end-of-the-line stops on the Underground Railroad, where slaves would eventually make their way to Canada and their freedom, were located here. Makes sense geographically. Cleveland is probably the closest part to the South that is also closest to Canada. This place was so well known for anti-slavery sentiment that after the famous raid on Harper's Ferry by John Brown, some of his sons escaped here to hide, knowing that the populace would shield them from being captured by authorities. And they were right. When Congress drew up a special committee to investigate the raid on Harper's Ferry and wanted John Brown's sons to come testify, they sent U.S. Marshals out here to get them. The Marshals came here and went right back to Congress. Apparently, the populace here was so supportive of John Brown's sons and were so armed and itching for a fight that the Marshals recommended to get John Brown's sons, they need armed forces. If you don't know about the raid on Harper's Ferry, something you need to learn about. It was one of the catalysts for the Civil War. But to give you a short rundown, there's a guy named John Brown who was a kook, but he was a kook for justice. And he decided he was going to start a slave rebellion to finally end slavery. And he raided a federal armory to get weapons for that rebellion. The raid failed quite spectacularly, but it showed America that the only way to end slavery at this point was through violence. To give you an idea about John Brown's importance to the Civil War, Northern troops actually marched singing a song about his body and how they were going to finish what he had started. I kind of gave away the plot, but you probably already knew. John Brown was definitely hung for what he did. But John Brown Jr. was untouched and eventually lived out the last of his days right next to this very lake. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. And for now, let's say bye to Cleveland and bye to the Great Lakes.